Welcome to this Skillick Explains video, and this time I want to look at a fairly topical issue, which is how do you make your cash work as hard as possible for you? Right, with no more ado, let's get on to a quote. As you know, I like to open these things with a quote. This time, P.T. Barnum: "Money is a terrible master, but an excellent servant." So keep that in mind as we go through. Now, the backdrop to what I'm about to say is we all need a certain amount of cash. It's certainly not a good idea to run your investment life, your wealth management strategy with no cash. The question is, how much is enough? The golden question. Unfortunately, the answer does vary according to a number of factors, but nonetheless, it's well worth thinking about. And once we've decided how much cash we're going to keep, this is the key really, how do we make sure it's working hard? How do we make sure that although cash doesn't tend to offer the long-term returns of, say, government gilts or equities, how do we make sure the bit that is cash is working for us? So, how much do we need? Now, I'll keep this fairly short. This is the three pots approach I've mentioned before. Basically, what are we trying to do here? What we're trying to do is to say we don't want all of our capital in cash necessarily, although I will indicate a situation where actually exactly that could happen. But most people need three pots. And the three pots generally are a cash pot to cover rainy day. Now, rainy day, don't forget, is that redundancy, that roof leaking, okay, that period when we can't earn for some reason. So we need cover for that, called a rainy day fund. The exact amount will vary depending on individual circumstances, but it's a number of months set to one side in cash, largely to be left for emergencies. Then we've got foreseeable calls on capital, and I'm very, very loosely going to say that might be somewhere we consider using IOUs, bonds, for reasons I'll come back to. Foreseeable calls on capital. An easy example, which won't apply to everybody for obvious reasons, is you've got to pay school fees in advance, right? You want to make sure that when a child hits 11, they go to secondary school, you want to afford private school, you can also afford to pay up front. That's a good example of a foreseeable on capital. This is an amount which is coming up, you know when, you can estimate how much it will be, all right? You're not talking about 20 years away, because, you know, when a child turns 11, that's a known finite amount of time. So you're not going to keep it all in cash. You're not probably going to keep it in equities, or at least you're not going to keep all of it in equities, like your lifetime savings. So there is a possibility you might keep it in something between cash and equities, IOUs for example. So you're going to set aside amounts to cover foreseeable calls on capital and then decide where the best home is for them. And then the rest, this is the idea behind the three pots, can be left alone to grow long-term, hopefully earning a decent rate of return above inflation in equities. And the whole point of this structure is, you know, once you've got your emergency funds and once you've provisioned for stuff that falls a bit further out but you know about, okay, and obviously these will change. I mean, as you go through life, you'll suddenly have another one of these, or you might fund one and tick it off the list. It's dynamic, all right? But the point is over here, what you're not doing, all right, when one of these comes up, all you need rainy day funds is liquidating that. You're leaving that alone, because the danger with liquidating an equity portfolio, using it like a cash point machine, is that if you do it at the wrong time, you can seriously damage its ability to generate long-term wealth. So that is a quick summary of something I've talked about before, but is really the key to all this. Rainy day funds then are going to be covering redundancy, illness and emergencies, largely speaking. The amount you need will be a multiple of your typical monthly expenditure, usually anywhere between 3 and 9 months. Tends to work in most circumstances, but the ultimate amount is a judgment call. It's a judgment call because some people are more nervous than others. Some people are older than others. Some people are in different situations and have dependents and others don't. Okay, so it is something that needs thinking about. I wouldn't just say, well, the answer's 3 months, Tim, because it might be for some people and it won't be for others. Now, just to illustrate my point about this is very personal to your situation, I want to go back to the Boots pension fund example. I'm going to keep this very, very snappy, but this at the time, a few years ago now, caused enormous media attention. People were going, they're mad, the Boots pension fund, what are they doing? Because what they did, quite clever really, the trustees of the Boots pension fund worked out, and there is a connection to what I just said coming up, worked out if you're running a pension fund, very crudely, what you've got is a load of assets, because basically people pay into their pensions, right? That money is then available to invest. So if you're running the pension funds as a trustee, there's a big pool of assets there, being the investment of pensions that have not yet been drawn down, if you like. And then you've got a whole pool of liabilities, being the fact that the people who are paying into the pot, helping you build up these assets, are going to want them back at some point. They're going to retire, right? So you've got an obligation, if you're running one of these things, to pay people in the future when they eventually stop work and go, right, where's my pension? Okay, so you've got this sort of juggling act, if you like. And what the Boots Pension Fund did one day is they woke up and thought, do you know what? We don't need to be in the traditional asset class that most of our competition's in, which is equities. Why? Because equities tend to be, compared to bonds and cash, the best long-term way to build wealth. And what they did is they said, actually, you know what? One day they just switched the whole lot into bonds. Now people are like, that's outrageous. You can't have a pension fund that's just invest in bonds. Well, we can actually, because we've worked out that there is no way that the pot we've got will ever be less than those liabilities. In other words, we don't need to take any investment risk. We can just move the whole lot into something safe. Because we know at this point in time, it's enough to cover all the financial liabilities looking ahead of the pension fund. Sound logic, right? Why take risk if there's no need to? Now, where's this going? Well, there is a point here. If I look at, now, some people watching this video will disagree with me here, but if I look at, say, my mum's situation, my mum is quite heavily in cash. Way more than 3 months of what used to be her monthly expenditure when she was working, mostly in cash. And the reason is that I've worked out that is almost certainly enough to cover all of her future liabilities, care fees, where she's living at the moment, and so on. So I've taken the slightly cautious view that actually it's her money. If there's enough in the pot to largely cover her future obligations, why risk any of it? Now, you say, well, the answer is, Tim, it will get bigger. Possibly, but it might also get smaller. All right? And some will say, what about future generations? What about inheritance? Well, I'm the kind of person that doesn't rely on inheritance. All right? Now, if you're running a family office, that's crazy. You should look at that, Tim. But actually, my view is, ultimately, that's my mum's money. I know what kind of commitment she's got coming up in the future. So actually, I'm going to sit on what would normally be considered to be way too much cash on her behalf for that reason. Everyone can then sleep soundly in their beds, if that makes sense. So this debate about how much cash is nuanced. And be careful when people try and say, oh, it's always 3 months of your gross monthly expenditure. It does depend on circumstances. Okay, getting the best return. So let's say you've decided you need a pot of cash. Rainy day, for example, some of those foreseeable calls on capital, perhaps. All right, where are you going to keep it? People sometimes say to me, what about a cash ISA? The problem with cash ISAs is this. If you pull money out of them, I mean, they're great because they offer a tax-free return potentially, but if you pull money out and you don't pay it back in within the same tax year, you then lose the future ISA shelter benefits. So it's nuanced really, they're not ideal. You've got to be pretty sure of your timing potentially to use that. If you're going to use a cash account outside of an ISA, consider a platform. And what I mean by that is, this is not an advert for platforms, but there are organisations out there that will basically say once you've done all the anti-money laundering and know your customer stuff once at the top, you can then access a whole load of cash accounts from different organisations and switch money between them according to the best rates really easily. Because otherwise it's a bit of a faff. If you're chasing, sort of Martin Lewis style, the best deposit rates, for example, every time you want to move, you're going to kind of close that, go through the know your customer money laundering with the organisations offering the new rate, open the account, 12 months later, close the account, move it. It's all quite a faff. So there are platforms out there that make that a bit easier, albeit they charge for that privilege. Foreseeable calls on capital, okay, these are that bucket two, those known bigger future commitments, not tomorrow, not emergency, they're planned for, okay, so the timing and the amount can be estimated. Think about that school fees bill paid in advance. It's going to happen when the kid turns 11, possibly earlier, possibly later. You're going to be able to estimate the amount because the school in question will give you that information, okay? What we're saying is you may want to look at something that's not cash, where the returns are very low, and something that's not equities, where the risk is too high. So a word about gilts, all right? Government IOUs, these can be quite a nice alternative to leaving it all in cash, struggling to earn a return outside NISA. The default risk is effectively zero, because since the establishment of the Bank of England, there's never been a default on a single gilt in issue, so that's quite nice. Cash flow yields are 100% predictable if you hold one of these things through to redemption. So in other words, unlike equities, with these IOUs, once you've bought it, as long as you hold it all the way through to redemption, either directly or through a fund, there is no danger of the return being anything other than down to the penny what you expect it to be. And there's a nice little kicker, which is qualifying bonds, which tends to be gilts, qualify, not just gilts by the way, but qualify for a capital gains tax exemption. All right. Now, a quick reminder, all right, just to sort of put a bit of flavour on what I've just said. So a gilt is just an IOU, so you put money in at the start and you hope to get it out when it matures. So there'll be a date at which the government basically pay back the loan, the gilt matures, to use the language, okay? And these things tend to mature at a fixed £100, all right? In the meantime, you can expect a nice string of regular coupons. So it's like a loan, put money in, receive coupons, get £100 back out at the end, ka-ching if you like. In the meantime, of course, the price, because this is a tradable security once you've bought it, will move. It will be £100 on redemption, but in the meantime it can move. But the point I was trying to make earlier on is this. It doesn't matter, let's say you buy it there, or you buy it there. These things trade in an active secondary market as IOUs. The moment you lock in and buy, as long as you hold it all the way through to redemption, you can predict precisely what your return is going to be. Now this makes them quite useful for those foreseeable calls on capital. Think about the school fees coming up at a known time in the future for a known amount. Wouldn't it be neat if you could get one of these things to coincide with that? So you buy it, knowing the yield you're going to get, and it matures just around the time you need the cash back. And the default risk is zero. It's something to bear in mind. Now, just to say a couple more things about these useful government IOUs. First of all, the return. And I want to just mention something out on the right-hand side. I mentioned that gilts are a good example of qualifying bonds, qualifying with HMRC, and they qualify for no capital gains tax. So on that wiggly line, you can imagine the price of the IOUs moving around, which means at any point in time between the point you buy and redemption, you might be looking at a capital gain or possibly a capital loss. But if you're looking at a capital gain, there's no tax to pay on that bit. And that pushes up the overall yield. So you'll see yields mentioned in the context of all bonds, but in particular government IOUs. The flat yield is the one that just considers that income stream I had up earlier just now. All right, the gross redemption yield considers the total return, so income plus any capital gain or loss. And the net redemption yield takes this number and factors in tax. And all I'm going to do here, without bamboozling you with loads of maths, is just to say because gilts are an example of an IOU that attracts that capital gains tax relief, what it means is the tax you pay on a gilt relative to another one which doesn't attract that relief is usually less. And that matters because what you might find is you could be looking at two bonds, A and B, all right, let's say A is not a qualifying bond, B is a qualifying bond, and what you might find is that the gross redemption yields, ignoring tax, are pretty similar. Right? They could be at different terms, different coupons, but the basic premise is they're offering a very similar level of return. But when you look at them on a net redemption yield basis, you'll find that the qualifying bond offers a higher net redemption yield. And that's the point of net redemption yields. Once you factor tax in, because these things do get that capital gains tax relief, often it means the net redemption yield looks better, even though superficially they're quite similar types of bond. And that's worth bearing in mind. Final example coming up. Cash equivalent yield. Let's say, just to fast forward, you found yourself a gilt with a net redemption yield of say 4.2%. And you're a higher rate taxpayer. The point is this: because of the tax relief, in order to match that from a deposit account, what are you going to need that deposit account to earn you? Bearing in mind it's a qualifying bond that gets that tax kicker. And the answer is, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, divide that by 0.6, you get about 7%. So the cash equivalent yield, this is where gilts can actually be quite impressive, is 7%. And then you've got to ask yourself the question, what cash deposit account pays that? And the answer is they're few and far between. So that's the point. Make sure you're comparing apples with apples, okay? When you're looking at, should I hold my foreseeable calls on capital pot in government IOUs, or should I keep it in a cash account? Quite important to bear tax in mind. Right, that's it. Now, if you're wondering about the maths back there, which I skated over, you can go to other Killick Explains videos. There's also some guides, new one coming up fairly soon. We'll deal with bonds specifically. And there's our quarterly magazine, Confidant.